rental reform, increased stamp duty, property prices at an all-time high. You might be looking at all this thinking, is 2025 the worst year to buy property in the UK? And as somebody who runs a company that buys £100 million worth of property every year and speaks to investors every day, I understand why you might be worried. So in today's video, I'm going to explain what we can learn from 2024 to make better decisions this year, the expensive mistake most investors will make in 2025, and whether 2025 is truly the worst year to buy or not. 2024 should have been a year of complete chaos. Everyone was talking about the potential impact of a Labour government, the election, and possible changes to capital gains tax. Many experts said that house prices would fall by anything from 2% to 4%, and some predicted the next apocalypse. But the reality turned out to be not as dramatic as the media had hoped for. Actually, 2024 turned out to be quite a normal year for property. According to the most recent nationwide figures, prices went up by an average of 3.7% compared to the previous year, which is actually surprisingly strong. However, when fear and hype take over, people don't always see the bigger picture. They panic, overreact, and often make decisions that they later regret. For example, I spoke to a lot of people this year who made a similar mistake to Kevin. He had a property worth £500,000, but he was spooked by fears of what a Labour government might do to capital gains tax. He'd bought it years and years ago when it was only worth £200,000, so the 20% increase in capital gains tax that was rumoured could have cost him as much as £60,000. So, in the middle of 2024, he rushed and sold his property for just £470,000. But when the budget was announced, it turned out there were no changes to capital gains tax on property. That meant that if he hadn't rushed, he could have held out for its true price with no tax consequences. That's a £30,000 difference that Kevin missed out on, all because he panicked about what might happen. So if there's one thing that 2024 taught us, it's that forecasts and predictions are rarely accurate enough to guide a smart investment strategy. In the short term, this could cost you £30,000 like it did Kevin, but over a longer period of time, the losses can be much more brutal. For example, there's a forum called House Price Crash, where for over a decade, a group of people have been waiting for prices in the housing market to collapse. They believe that the 2008 crash wasn't deep enough, and they're convinced that the big one is still on the horizon. As a result, they've stayed on the sidelines, sharing every piece of evidence they can find to support their beliefs. But guess what? While they've been waiting, the average UK property has gone up in price by 81%. That means that if you bought a house worth £160,000 back in 2008, which was the average, today it would be worth nearly £290,000. That's an increase of just under £130,000 in just 15 years. What's even more impressive is that if you'd bought as a homeowner using a 10% deposit, around £16,000 in 2008, that same deposit would have grown in value 8 times over by today. At some point, they will be right. There will be a crash. But will the crash be so big that it wipes out the 81% gain and takes prices back to 2008 levels? It seems highly unlikely. Yet, it's an easy trap to fall into because there's always something on the horizon that threatens to change everything and feels like a good excuse to wait and see. And 2025 will be no different. And just before we get into our predictions for 2025, if you want to stay up to date with the property market and receive tips on how and where to invest, you can sign up to our free weekly newsletter in the description. Already, we can see the government's renters' rights bill causing terror among landlords, because if you have a tenant who's not paying, it could take a lot longer to get them out, leaving you to pay the bills out of your own pocket. And it would be easy to use this as another reason to wait and see. And lots of potential investors will do just that, staying on the sidelines for another year. These reforms will also push lots of long-term landlords to sell their properties. But here's where most people go wrong. When they hear news like landlord purchases are down by 40% compared to 2015, or that 30% of landlords have sold one of their rental properties in the past year, they think the buy-to-let market is dead. And I'm not denying that investing has become a lot harder. There are stricter regulations, higher taxes, and rising mortgage rates. So for smaller landlords who've owned 1 or 2 properties for years and don't treat property as a serious business, these pressures have become the final straw. But this also creates an opportunity to zig when others are zagging, because all these long-term landlords getting out is already creating a classic supply and demand problem in the rental market, which means 2 things for you as a potential investor. First, rents are likely to rise as the supply shrinks. And second, there'll be more opportunities to buy property from landlords looking to exit the market. But there's another fear that could keep investors afraid that 2025 will be a nightmare year. Given that mortgage rates are much higher than they have been in the recent past, and there's little hope of them coming down much further, and given that prices are already near their all-time high, does that mean that 2025 is the year when we finally get that crash that some people have been waiting for since 2009? Well, no one can predict the future, but if you look at what's happened in the past, it's highly unusual to get a crash without a boom coming first. What normally happens is there's nothing much to worry about. People are feeling good, the economy's doing well, so the market feels stable and everyone gets the idea that it's a good time to buy. Everyone piles in at the same time, prices rocket upwards, and suddenly you're being tempted into paying more than you should. Then, at some point, reality kicks in. Confidence evaporates and prices crash back down. In fact, the worst time to buy is when everyone else is convinced that it's a great idea. But it doesn't feel like we're anywhere close to that boom mentality today. There isn't much excitement in the market right now. And most predictions are for prices to go up by 2 to 3% at best in 2025. So if 2025 does turn out to be unremarkable, with property prices ticking up just slightly amid a general lack of enthusiasm, that wouldn't give the impression of a crash being just around the corner. And these subdued conditions could actually be perfect for investors who are getting started right now. And that is the main thought that I take into 2025. It sounds crazy, but there are people who've listened to our podcast every week for a decade and still haven't bought a single property because they've always been waiting for that perfect moment. First, it was Brexit, then the economy, and then Labour's policies. There's always something to worry about. But the right time isn't when everyone feels good and are all rushing into the market. It's when others are hesitant. So yes, the game has got tougher. But if you stay informed about rental reforms, choose the right tenants, and keep your rent in line with market rates, in 2025, there could be a big opportunity for serious investors to get involved as others get cold feet. However, I know that the hardest part of investing is the beginning, and taking that first step to find the right property and get over the fear of that first purchase can be really daunting. So if you're in that position, check out our Beginner's Guide to Property, where I break down step by step everything you need to know about buying property in 2025.